webinar in particular, focusing really on the 8 steps and the sort of macro level of engaging men, we're really wanting to provide you with a step-by-step, comprehensive, sustained approach to engaging boys and men, and to familiarize, with questions to ask at each step, really to Pat's title, strategy and planning, really thinking about how to strategize and plan for ways to engage men and boys in this work. And then provide you with an example of organizations applying these steps, which brings us to the JWI. Is there a slide for that up here?
So yeah, there is actually. Yeah.
So the Jewish Women International is an organization. Well, Pat, do you want to tell the story since you had done the impact case? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So Jewish Women International is an organization Men Can Stop Rape worked with through the Office on Violence Against Women, Children and Youth Engaging Men grant program. And to those community organizations out there who don't know that grant program and you want to do engaging men work, it is a great resource. So I suggest you look it up. Because it's a great source of funding for engaging men work, especially in community. Which includes, if you're school-based, you can do it. If you're, just a lot of different organizations do it. And it is organizations who apply for it, not schools, actually. I don't want to mislead you on that. But so it's a grant program where the initial thing you have to do is some assessment work and identify the organization that you're going to work with. So they identified a Orthodox Jewish community just outside of Baltimore, and which can be challenging for them. It was their values and the Orthodox Jewish community were significantly different in terms of the Orthodox Jewish community they were going to work with. Their values were very conservative. And so it's a question of how do they go in there and do healthy masculinity work. And they had some ideas. They had done some engaging men programming. It wasn't in depth, but they thought they would be building on it. So it's a 3-year project, so they worked with us. And with us as technical assistance providers, we were serving as technical assistance providers for OVW on that particular grant program. And then they worked in the community for 3 years. So we gave them a lot of input, a lot of technical assistance, did quite a few trainings with them, and just helped them prepare to do the work. And that'll become clearer. Hopefully you've got the impact case study and had a chance to read it. And we're going to build on that throughout the course of this session today.
Thanks, Pat. So I know I'm bouncing around a little bit. I'm just going to go back a slide to our question here. So we're really wanting to, as we kick things off here, hear from you all. What are some things that you all are currently doing to engage men and boys? And if you, want to unmute yourself and explain a little bit more, or just type in the chat box and, hit on a few key points, ways that you're engaging men and boys. We'd really like to give you all a chance to not only share out on what you're doing, but give you all a chance to see what others are doing as well before we get into some of the 8 steps. So can I ask folks to jump in and respond to the question?
It's like some people are typing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're not.
And take your time, because it's helpful to us to have a sense of what you are doing.
And I'll just add, from the facilitation standpoint, or the participant standpoint, it can be a challenge to capture, all that you may be doing, or all that you'd like to do, across some different planes. So if you want to keep it brief and abbreviated, we can work with that still. So any responses are really welcome. Thanks, Jessica. We see from the Family Refuge Center, used to have a men's outreach committee that you'd love to bring back. And the goal of the committee was to provide opportunities for men to be involved in your work, fundraising, outreach, and education. More men, yeah. Great, thank you.
And I'd also be interested, and Jeremy, I assume you would be too, but it could be that some of you aren't doing anything to engage men, and that's okay. And if you could let us know whether you're, even when you're not doing anything to engage men, if that's the case as well, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that, Pat.
Yeah.
Is somebody ready? Does somebody want to talk?
We may have somebody who just needs to mute themselves.
Yeah.
We got from Stacy at one of the universities that Stacy does awareness events at. Stacy's organization, the university staff partner with fraternities. Several events for Sexual Assault Awareness Month are made mandatory for the fraternities. Mm-hmm. Nikki's saying that you all don't think you've done much, likely why there may be a lack of responses. The campuses did see an increase in representation from athletic departments and coordinated community response teams. And from others hasn't been quite a strong suit, but we've hired 2 full-time male advocates, moving in the right direction. As we mentioned, coaching boys into men, but couldn't get any takers. Our agency does not prioritize engaging men, but we have male advocates as well. Got some men's leadership retreats in the past where we discuss masculinity. Mm-hmm. Also partner with substance abuse programs and transition houses to speak about substance abuse and sexual violence with men, consent, bystander intervention training, but you'd like to do more. Okay. So thank you all for sharing, especially sharing for those who may not do a lot or may, want to do more than you currently do. We're really familiar. We were just talking about this earlier, Pat. Sometimes folks will come to our training saying, well, this is the only one available, or this is the first time, we have the opportunity to since, I got hired at such and such university. And so, that's helpful for us to hear and to know, and I think helpful, to sort of set the tone for our webinar today, because really, it's great to, our approach is meeting people where they're at. And it's great to say, well, what's the starting place? Where's the first place that we need to go in order to either begin or continue or expand or deepen doing the work? There's a lot of different directions to go in at a macro structural kind of level. And I think, it's helpful for us to hear from you as we sort of draw from the JWI case study to frame, a little bit how we are going to be talking about these different steps and the roles that they'll play in supporting your all's ability and capacity to go in the directions that you want to go in for engaging boys and men in this work the ways that you want to. Pat, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered it all.
So I'm going to move us along here and get us into our 8 steps. So,
well, let me just say, just in terms of
sure.
how the 8 steps might help you, And again, some of you may, you may look at step 1 and think, oh, we've already done that, or step 2. But, if that's the case, then if some of this is familiar, then I just want to encourage you to think of yourself as a resource for the people who haven't done all this at this point. So, some of you may have implemented all of these steps. Some of you may have implemented some of them. So it may be the case that, likely that we're not the only ones who are thinking about these 8 steps. So I hope you turn to each other as resources to kind of think through and the process for applying any of them or all of them. Because I think it's important to really recognize anywhere where there is experience and strength.
And Pat, if I am correct, also, while we may, sequentially order the 8 steps, to some degree, step 1 through 8, we also know that, in many ways, like you had said, some communities will have some of these things in place, some may not have some of them in place, or to different degrees, and so it may not evolve in this chronological order for you all, and that's okay. That's part of the process of this whole set of steps and work. So looking at our first step here, we really want to emphasize the idea that there is a team that's responsible for increasing not only a larger team, but also that smaller team's members, but also the community's knowledge about the role that masculinity plays in preventing gender-based violence, and then also for developing a comprehensive, engaging voice and prevention strategy. And one thing, that we'd like to emphasize here is the team aspect of it. I'm thinking of for the, universities and for the organizations who are challenged to even come up with one person who can really be primarily responsible for some of these things. We know how some of those barriers may exist, and also how, just getting up to that point of capacity can be a real success and a real win and a great step in the right direction. And we also want to encourage and support, even if folks, I'm pulling from some of my experience being a point of contact for campus grantees, the OVW campus grant. There are many folks who may be interested in the work and don't have quite the level of expertise or knowledge or, haven't had all the training that they'd like to feel more authorized to participate. But even the desire to help can be a place to start for forming a small team and for initially creating the structure, because we do want to support that it's more than just one person being responsible for this. There's a role that this team in particular holds on to that is entirely responsible for raising the community's awareness about masculinity and its connection to preventing gender-based violence.
And I think a lot of times it does get all shouldered by one person, and so it's like, oh, we hired somebody to do all this. So, but ideally, and under the best of circumstances, it really is a team commitment and a team process, because it is a community-wide engagement that works best. And Jeremy, as you move on to the next slide, I was wondering whether Nikki, you might be willing to unmute yourself and talk about the CCRT. Is that a possibility?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I was just commenting on that, and actually Jessica and Stacy, who also commented as well, are probably work with the 2 campuses that we've seen some engagement. But I will say, based on conversations we've had in the past, that is why we were really looking forward to having you all, because we just hadn't done much work in this. And when we did first receive our OVW campus grants that our council has been a huge part of, we it wasn't a mandatory piece of the grant, and so we kind of pulled folks, and there was so much going on at the time, we just weren't ready to go there. So honestly, this is really what we were hoping to kind of kick off some of our initial steps to really starting to intentionally engage boys and men on campuses. With the CCRTs, I think just the conversation around it really started to draw folks to the table to start talking about it. Unfortunately, with those teams, oftentimes we see that it's difficult for them to meet regularly, but there were some movements towards having folks come in and talk to teams. But I think on some campuses what we saw was, students just being very uncomfortable, almost describing it as defensive of the approach that was taking. So some folks really had to go back to the drawing board and look at the lens that they were looking through and how we can effectively get buy-in. I think what we've seen on national level, the effective buy-in is really starting to have those conversations and meeting people where they're at, like you all had said.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of forming this small team, I mean, a lot of times the CCRTs are a coordinated community response team, and I think it's there are different understandings of coordinated community response team. I think in the domestic violence world, it's a little bit different than maybe in the world of the college and university, which is our main experience probably. I mean, we were the technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women campus program for quite a while, for about 10 years. And the CCRTs there were really important just in terms of making it a campus-wide issue and really trying to create the kind of campus culture that you want. And you can't do that unless you involve the whole campus. So the idea was that the CCRT would pull people from different parts of the campus to form that coordinated community response team. And you can kind of apply the same idea to really engaging men as well. And I think because actually it was Jeremy and I went to Holland, Michigan. Do you remember the name of the organization, Jeremy?
Well, they used to be called the Center for Women in Transition, but now it's Resilience.
Yeah, Resilience. And we did a training there, a workshop, a day and a half training with them. That really was about forming a CCRT specifically focused around engaging men. And, it was about really forming a team. And so, they had pulled in high school coach, former high school coach, I think. Who else, Jeremy? Do you remember who else?
Yeah, they had their engagement coordinator. They pulled in the high school coach. They pulled in a counselor from the university. They had pulled in a couple of other community members who interact with boys and men more regularly, but not in the sexual assault space. And I think they had one business leader, a businessman of some kind, was there as well.
Right, they did, yeah. Yeah, and they recognized they had to really work to pull in more people too. They had only just begun in some ways, so that they were building relationships still, as you were suggesting, Nikki, and that's kind of a crucial part of this. But somebody has to be in a position to build those relationships, and so it's best if it's not just one person, even if it's a small team, I would say. Of 2 or 3 people to really kind of build that larger sort of team, and so that's that's the idea here. You want to move on to the questions?
Oh, can you not see them?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can. Sorry, didn't realize you'd already done it.
Yep.
So some of the questions you might ask as you're forming this team. Who are the best people for the team? What roles should they play? And what is their level of commitment? If you're on a campus or there's campuses in your community, I mean, it's not unusual for there to be either professors who are teaching on issues related to gender and masculinity, or you know, it's possible that there are teachers in high schools that might be interested in that sort of sense, but also, as Jeremy's pointing out, business leaders, faith-based leaders, you know, who are the ones you can connect with, and who are the ones who are, because it's always going to be a core group that's going to do the heavy lifting. So, you know, it's like, who's going to be the core group that's going to do the heavy lifting, and then what's going to be the larger group that you can involve and make connections with and get them engaged, but in a lesser way. They won't be doing a lot of the lifting. So what trainings are available for team members that will build a masculine gender lens, and are the trainings theory-driven and positive? So, you know, and it could be that, you know, somebody who's already well-trained in terms of, or not even well-trained, but has had some trainings in addressing issues around masculinity, is in a position to do this. I'm thinking of Seth at Resilience, who was one of our contacts there, and I think he'd done some significant work and, you know, was really building his ability to do more and more trainings. And I think he's been doing actually a series of online trainings now lately. I think 5 online trainings for people in the community, but also I think beyond our community as well. So those are just some of the questions you might ask.
And I want to add too, Pat. I mean, Nikki, I really like what you brought up about approach. I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about building relationships in the next step, but really, relationship building is present in every step, and it's sort of ongoing. You know, sort of at all times almost, right? And I think one of the things that, you know, Pat, to you bringing up Seth, that supported him being such a central role in, you know, Resilience's team building out, you know, their engagement in CCRT and their work, was that he was really clearly a credible messenger. He had already had relationships and respect among groups of men. And, you know, so he was in a position that was really, you know, he was in a good position to do the work. The thing, though, I remember, one of the things I remember was that, you know, he was sort of encouraged to do the work and sort of told that he could do it well. And I'm thinking back to some of my experience as a college student, being invited to some of the, you know, before Goucher had something like a CCRT, being invited to some of those spaces to be part of the conversation. You know, so much of it, back to the thing that Nikki's saying about approach, and to this last question about the trainings being theory-driven and positive, the reinforcement that's positive in saying, yes, you can do this, and there's all the support here to help you sort of figure it out, I think is also sort of a central component here that's kind of, you know, implicit in all the questions that we're asking and all the different parts of who's the best, you know, people for this team.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, and it might be that you're connecting with other organizations as well, or I'm thinking of, in terms of Seth, he had contacts with, he had graduated from the local college, so he had a lot of contacts there, and he was using them as well. So, and one of the things we did with them was just figure out, had each of them write, each of the people who were participating, just write a list of their contacts that they thought might make sense. And so they, how many people ended up? Probably 30, 40 people, something like that, of possible contacts. You know, they just did some mapping in terms of people from, you know, different segments, different kinds of professions, that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, once they got going, it was sort of like, I almost sensed like they wanted to leave the room and start doing the outreach right then. They were like, okay, ready, let's go.
Yeah. But then they realized they needed to pull back, though, a little bit and plan a little bit more, too, at the same time, before they do that. So step 1, showing up in the Jewish Women International Impact Case study. You know, their case was so interesting because that it was a very insular group, and, you know, so they were trying to make their way into they had to get buy-in, and without that buy-in, their whole project would fall apart. So they quickly realized, and we kept stressing this: you have to get buy-in. If you don't do that, it's not going to work. So here's the way to do it. So they, rather than kind of going in there and telling people in the community, especially the influencers who were ultimately the rabbis in the community, rather than telling them what they plan to do and why they thought that was the right approach, they used the whole assessment part of the work that they had to do to interview them and say, well, what do you think would work in this situation? And so they were getting their buy-in and their investment because they were consulting them, basically, rather than telling them. And it was a hard shift for them. If you look at the impact case study, you may not have it printed out, but on the second page, under how JWI used Men Can Stop Rape support, when we were stressing this, they said that they realized that, quote, men needed to be the leaders of the project as a means of creating community buy-in. If you go into a community in a negative way, you say you're the community, meaning the community, patriarchal, all the things that one could say looking at many communities. You might say it looking at this one, you're not going to get anywhere. And so they had that realization, and in a sense they bought into what we were trying to convince them of. And so that first crucial step was really interviewing the rabbis. And the second crucial step for them was hiring two rabbis who, and you might see this in the impact case study too, who were both social workers. And so they could really navigate both the world that was familiar to Jewish Women International and navigate the world that was the Orthodox Jewish community. And so, they were really the go-betweens in really significant ways. If they hadn't found them, I think that it also wouldn't have worked. And it was really the two rabbis who were forward-facing. They were the ones who really became the face of the project in a lot of ways. And they were, leaders on the committee that ultimately formed that approved everything, and and the committee members were all part of the community. So in terms of this particular step one, it was, and as I think Jeremy's pointing out too, in a lot of ways, that step one and step two kind of go hand in hand. These are all broken down in chronological order, but they don't necessarily work that way. Sometimes they're going on at the same time. So they did just an incredible job of laying the groundwork. And I think people tend to underestimate the time it takes to do this first step and really the second step as well, because it takes much longer than people think. A lot of people are ready to get to, the programming. But, what proved to be the case here is that if you didn't do this part, the programming really wasn't going to work in the way it should. So, Jeremy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to add too, sort of the what's particular about this impact case study and about, Jewish Women International. The things that you're talking about, Pat, with like the relationship building and having to really get these credible messengers on board first as the foundation to lay before programming can exist. It even took some, real, like going against the grain a little bit, like they had to, in their own internal team, say, okay, this might sound crazy, but I think we should apply for a grant about engaging boys and men, even though we're the Jewish Women International. If our primary goal is, and I'm not familiar with their specific, mission and vision, but if their primary goal is, supporting and serving, women in the Jewish community, then the things that are required to say, I think if we invest in, developing healthy masculinity in the boys and men in the community, that will serve our mission and vision or goals of supporting, uplifting, empowering the women in our community. And so even at that internal conversation to say, we should do this, it's sort of all built into the things that we're talking about with forming this team and with even going in that direction. You can see these different kinds of relationship building and team building tasks, all playing into what eventually became the things that we're highlighting here in their impact case study.
And just in terms of Jeremy's point, actually, the people we were working with at JWI had to convince the board and the executive director and others to actually go in that direction. It wasn't an easy sell initially. It took some work to really get the organization to invest in, along with everything else, to invest in engaging men. And I did want to point out, Nikki, I see your comment, and I hope you're on at the session tomorrow, which is really about the very thing that you're writing about in terms of bystander intervention and potentially using that as a way of engaging men, and intentionally using that as a way of engaging men. So I think the session tomorrow will really speak to what you're writing about there.
I don't know that's to step two.
But I mean, can you, before we go on to step two, can people just say a little bit about whether this step one makes sense to you? Is it something, I think, Christina is suggesting some possibilities for, it's really about partnerships and relationships. But does it make sense to you? Do you think it's relevant? How might it apply to the work that you want to do or that you're already doing? We're just curious about whether this resonates with you. And if you don't have Christina's writing, Stacy, so we'll give them a little bit of time. And I think we're going to ask that for like the first three steps, because really these are the steps, the first three I think are especially important in terms of starting to do the work and doing it in a way that makes sure that you're able to move forward the way you want to. For me, it's like when I used to teach writing at university, and so I did a lot of writing also. And for me, it's like when I was working on a paper or article or whatever it was, if I got the introduction right, then I felt like everything else kind of flowed. And I think these first few steps are that way as well.
So we've got some responses, and Christina and Stacey had shared. Partnerships are difficult to forge, through or in certain populations. Definitely something that Christina's striving for. Makes sense to Stacey. Using the structures that be and engaging the people in power keeps from reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, and I just want to stress that. Why don't we go on to building relationships, because I think that it'll become clear how those two are connected. So in order to more effectively develop strategy and program, the team increases the number of male partners across the community by devoting time to building relationships. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about. I like to argue that it's a big shift, because I think when we think about the work that needs to be done with men and boys, it's often about conveying to them, telling them what they don't know, what we think they don't know. And here we are suggesting, well, consult them and see what they do know and what they do think. And so we're turning everything on its head. But I guarantee if you do that, you will, begin to build the relationships that you're really wanting, I would assume, and that, will move your work forward. So I would encourage you to kind of think of it that way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all the information they give you is good or it's going to be useful, or some of it will be, some of it won't be. But, recognize that it's not just about, whether this information is going to be, all of it's going to be useful, but it's also about you learning from them where they are, because you're going to do a better job, as Nikki was talking about, of meeting them where they are, and then, getting their buy-in, because they feel like, oh, I was heard. People like to be listened to, heard, taken seriously. I feel like I've given some input into this, so, it positions them differently. It positions you differently. So those kinds of conversations, however you want to do them, whether it's forming a committee, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's focus groups, whether it's, whatever way you want to do them, interviews, however it works for you, multiple ways, that approach is important. When we do our public education campaigns, you might have seen Where Do You Stand? The coalition has purchased Where Do You Stand materials for campuses. In the creation of those, we always involve young men, in this case, college men, young men. We do focus groups. We did 5 focus groups, I think 4 or 5 focus groups, to figure out what messaging works here. And the messaging we start out with is very rare that it's the messaging we end up with. But, it also not only helps us because we get a sense of what resonates with them and works for them, but they come out of it feeling good, frankly. I mean, they come out of a focus group feeling like, yeah, I contributed. So.
Well, I don't know if it's that rare, Pat. But I do want to add too. I should say, and I want to add to what you're saying, Pat. I really hear in it the opportunity that assessing the community's needs presents to form and build some relationships as well. And in the larger scope, yesterday we talked about dominant stories of masculinity, dominant stories in general. If we look at the dominant story of trying to engage as a sexual assault focused office or team or organization, men in the community, whether they be in particularly homogenous groups like athletics or fraternities, if the dominant story of that dynamic is that we're coming in to tell you what you're doing wrong, then to approach men and approach the boys in the community, approach the allies in the community for their opinions, for their perspective, subverts that whole dynamic in the early stages of just building out this team, that then foreshadows later, gives them a sense, this is kind of what the program might be like. This is kind of, what it might be like down the road for you. And I think also leaves some of that, feeling that there's a benefit. I feel good after leaving, after working with Stacy, I felt better than when I first went to go meet with Stacy. So now, when Stacy calls again, I wonder, what does she want? What does she need? How can I help?
And that doesn't mean, we're not suggesting either that you never challenge them or, that you don't hold them accountable. But, this is the other part of the work. And it's in our Men of Strength clubs, for instance. We always say that if you don't build the relationships, if you don't put that first, then the club's not going to work. So it's the same thing here. The facilitator has to spend time investing in building relationships, showing that he or she, in most or Wise Club, is interested in what they have to say. It's the same thing here.
And I think that's a great example, Pat, for stepping into some of the questions related to this relationship building step. What are the cultural values of the audience, and how might they connect with engaging men and boys? How can you use the values to persuade potential partners? I mean, I think about the invitation of open meetings that the Most Club offers, or the Most Club socials that we'll host before the club, officially begins. It does take a little bit of, paying attention to and learning from, being a part of the community and being in touch with the cultural values that are present, to say, at this Most Club social, we're going to show this kind of a movie and invite, who would like to come watch the movie? And using some of those, cultural touch points to start to not only relationship build, but form who will be in the club as an invitation. And then one of the other questions, we've got here is, do you have any personal and professional stories that relate to the potential partners that you can use to persuade them? Relationship building, as we all know, really, is accentuated by and can be strengthened by telling stories and finding ways to connect with folks and making that known. Pat, do you want to add anything?
Nope. You want to move it to the next slide? And let's see. Why don't you go ahead and talk about this one first?
Well, I think, where we can see, in the JWI Impact case study, there's a few different places where the relationship building was really important. That's why I went back to, having to convince the executive director, having to convince the board that JWI should even apply for this grant for working with boys and men, to then, forming the different relationships with the rabbis in particular, who were not only credible messengers, but were really essential to also the structure of introducing some of, these conversations and these ideas into the public consciousness of the community. It required them to say, yes, we are lifting this up and believe in it, in order for others in the community to say, oh, now that you're saying it, I'll listen. And so, we can see some of the relationship building happening there in the story. I'm looking at my notes here, pointing to it as an opportunity in conducting the needs assessment, as well as, on the last page there, looking at the CHANA, the partner organization to JWI on the grant, who, played a role of leading the steering committee that consisted of the rabbis and as consultants and several other rabbis from the community. So we see some of these different ways that the relationship building that they did really laid the foundation for the work that they were eventually able to do. And I go back to what Nikki had said about relationship building and the approach, getting buy-in, that we see that show up with, what Ms. Rosenblum said, pretty early on in how JWI used Mixer support. We say Mixer, short for Men Can Stop Rape, acknowledging their culture and then working with that. If you go in a negative way, it's not going to work. And so, really introducing some of the positivity of relationship building throughout this impact case study. You see it's not just a hope, it's a strategic investment that yielded sustainable results. And so, Pat, unless you want to add anything too, again, we're, wanting to know, how is this relevant for you?
Can I change the,
yeah.
Let's change the question. I want to change the question just a little bit, make it a little bit more specific. And I want to ask, who's one person that you would want to build a relationship with that you think could help move forward engaging men work in your community? Who's one person? And you don't have to name the person, but just the title of the person, or some descriptive language of the person that, because I'd be curious about who your coach is. Yes, and is there a particular coach that, because a lot of times it's a matter of figuring out, well, which coach is going to be, or which coaches are going to be my ally in this. So, you know, it's a matter of trying to find the ones that, and obviously in terms of the coaches, the ones that are further up the ladder are probably the better. I mean, even if you get to the AD, the athletics director, then you've got, you know, you're in a better position to get coaches buy-in, certainly, than if you know, you've got a coach. I mean, maybe, Jeremy, as a college athlete, maybe you could speak a little bit about coaches and kind of what it would mean to get a coach on board.
Yeah, and I see folks typing in too. We've got police officers as well. You know, while folks are typing in, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I could speak for all college collegiate athletic departments.
No.
But I will say that, you know, I know that at Goucher, like there are things that the campus is doing now that didn't exist when I was a student, and it was all the students and all the different staff. You know, particularly the women who came before me and did all kinds of work to lay the foundation for healthy masculinity programming that has led to a normalcy for the coaches to be thinking about and talking about this as they build their teams. And I know that, you know, every athletics department coach, you know, that I've worked with has talked about the importance of team building. And that they're really interested in not just how the guys show up on the field, but how the guys show up off the field. And, you know, maybe I will be a little bit daring in speaking for, you know, different college programs to say that they're dealing with, you know, alcohol violations, and, you know, teams have different rules with relationships to alcohol and drug education and prevention or abstinence usage, underage drinking, how the team handles those sorts of things. And, you know, I know that that was an entree into thinking about, well, for our teams here at Goucher, we're wanting to, you know, make sure that they academically perform well and that they're respected members of the community. And here are ways to achieve those goals. Here are opportunities to learn and grow. And having one coach and the AD, you know, on board has made it so that the entire athletic department has a different view and thinks differently about masculinity and engaging and teaching their teams the character building that they all are interested in.
Actually, the last Healthy Masculinity Training Institute that we do, which is, you know, when we do it in person, it's 3 days, and our most in-depth training, there was, what, 2 Goucher, were both of them coaches?
You know, one was the women's tennis coach, the other was a trainer. We're fortunate that Goucher has had a lot of interaction between Goucher and Men Can Stop Rape. And I see Ashley had commented as well, you know, Title IX maintains a strong relationship with the athletic department. You know, back to Pat's point earlier about the expertise that you all have. I'd be really interested to know, Ashley, what are some of the things that allow you to maintain a strong relationship? What are some of the things that strengthen the relationship? And if you want, please do share, but I would also say others, you know, if I'm not going to invite on Ashley's behalf, but others to think about, you know, what expertise does Ashley and Ashley's team have to offer, especially for others who are trying to engage coaches.
Mm-hmm. Again, what were you going to say something?
Yeah,
is there someone
I was just going to add something, and it'd probably take us a little bit back, but hopefully not too much in the conversation. I was just thinking about, you know, as you were talking about positive messages and how, you know, one of the first things I think we've kind of learned throughout the years is how our message can be stigmatized, or it can be taken in the wrong way. So when folks were doing prevention programming, you know, when there were folks who identified as male in the room, they may not have felt validated if they were survivors. And then the takeaway message that folks were hearing was, you know, most men are rapists. So I think, like, thinking really hard about our message and how we do engage folks is so important. And when we first talked about bringing you all in several years ago and said, you know, who could you bring with you to the table? And I think folks didn't know how to approach people because men hadn't been part of their movement on campus, and so it was like, well, we don't have anyone to bring, so, you know, how can I even start this conversation? And then I think the other thing that we saw from folks was fear of when they do start engaging in conversations that those folks aren't where we are today, and, you know, which they haven't done all the studying, they haven't worked with victims. You know, we couldn't expect that of folks, and I think that we all kind of had to come to that realization and get over that fear of what if someone says the wrong thing, or I, you know, ask them to co-facilitate, but then they continue to, you know, say stereotypical myths or perpetuate myths about sexual violence. So I think that was a big fear for folks, and I'm really glad to, you know, be having some of these conversations to say, you know, there's not going to be probably a perfect fit for us, but to start having the conversations and including those folks and not giving up until they are at the table so that we can have those meaningful conversations, but also being open to listening to hear what...
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and thank you so much for bringing it up, because nobody's going to get it right. I mean, all the men you speak to are going to get it wrong in some way or other. You know, in the course of our work, we certainly haven't gotten it right all the time, as I suggested through the story that I told yesterday. And I certainly didn't start out where I am now, and I wouldn't claim to have everything figured out. By any means. I mean, I have a lot more figured out now than I did previously, but, you know, things keep changing. I mean, I'm 64 now, so new issues keep popping up all the time in ways they didn't when I was younger. So it's just a, you know, a whole different kind of issue. And I think that there's that fear a lot of times and frustration because you want people to be over here and, you know, they're back here. But that's just the reality. And if you don't accept that, then you leave them out of the conversation. So, you know, it's just a matter of whether you want to be inclusive and whether you're willing to struggle with them in a way that's constructive. And,
Pat,
and hopefully they're willing to
tell a quick story about that?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Just real quick, I'm just thinking while we're talking about athletics, while we're talking about these relationship-building components, another impact case study that we did, you know, with another college campus who we worked with, Doane University, through our Healthy Masculinity Campus Athletics project. Our contact there, Susanna, had shared a story about a peer educator who applied to be a peer educator and was trained in some of the healthy masculinity exercises and approaches that we've talked about here and others that were all part of that campus athletics project. And this young man who was not a college athlete was facilitating a workshop with one of the teams. And this was a team that presented some more defensiveness and more resistance to the work. And while doing our continuum exercise, which you may be familiar with or may not hear us talk about at other points, you know, they were engaging in a conversation, presenter and presentees, about a particular, you know, attitude that reflects patriarchy, that reflects rape culture. And I don't know what the card was in particular, but the boys on that team were not convinced that it was harmful, that it was a harmful thing to say or to believe, an attitude to have. And the facilitator, that young peer educator, refused to let them, you know, believe that, refused to move on, and they stayed on that card for the majority of that session. And of course, the peer educator walked away feeling like, oh no, I just like ruined our relationship with, you know, such and such team over here. And meanwhile, the team went back to the coach and said, you know, I may disagree with that guy, but I respect that he didn't, you know, give in and that he stayed, you know, with his original opinion. And that interaction allowed for future conversations in a different way than I think both parties were expecting there. The relationship building of, you know, I'm going to stay steadfast in that situation really benefited being able to do future conversations and ultimately changing the culture of that team.
Yeah, and I'm noticing some people wrote, so Ashley was qualifying and said that works with a dual agency, and the Title IX actually attends their sexual assault. And then basically the Title IX person or people are really great community partners, which, you know, that's exactly in line with what we were talking about. And so a lot of times your community partners, the strong community partners you have, will lead you to other community partners or connections. So, you know, that's what I think Ashley is pointing out and is really valuable to take into account and keep in mind. And male teachers can be helpful. Definitely, there's usually some that are sensitive to this or invested in it or want to be potentially, maybe want to mentor young men, college campus, residential staff. So, I mean, there's any number of possibilities, both in the community, both on a campus, and it's really just exploring who they might be, who has connections, or, you know, investing in time in building connection, whether it's just, I mean, sometimes with the resilience training we did, I think one of the, was it the Title IX? No, I think it was just one of the prevention staff from one of the colleges in the area realized after we'd done this training, it's like, oh, well, maybe it's just me kind of inviting this person out for a cup of coffee and sitting down and talking with them and not really, you know, being in an educational mode, or, you know, it's just really kind of like, well, let's connect and kind of see what, you know, kind of connection we can build. So let's move on. So thank you for your input in all of that, and we've really spent some time on that just because we feel like it's really crucial and important. So you know, I would really encourage you to really think about ways in which you can spend that time building relationships, and do it in a way that, I mean, you know how to build relationships, so, you know, don't let your professional training get in the way of the knowledge that you have that's related to building relationships. So just keep all that in mind. So step 3, the team and key partners develop a comprehensive, integrated, engaging boys and men strategy that employs various kinds of programming. And for, you know, you can do this in any number of different ways. I mean, it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed. It can be, you know, I think just, okay, here's our plan. It doesn't have to be a strategic plan. Sometimes a logic model, I don't know. Just whatever works for you, so that you all have a sense of, whoever is on this team, we have a sense of, okay, this is the direction we're headed. This is how we're going to do it. This is what we want to do, and so on and so forth. So, you know, that should be an important part of it. And again, people just want to get out there and do the trainings, but we're suggesting this is another kind of foundational element as well. So, Jeremy, you want to talk about the questions?
Sure. So, you know, some of the questions that we would offer for this step are, you know, where are we now in terms of engaging boys and men? Back to some of the needs assessment work that is talked about in the JWI case study, and then where do we want to go? You know, how will we get where we want to go? You know, who will help us, and how will they help us get where we want to go? You know, there's obviously, you know, I would imagine that all of you are, you know, really skilled and have experience with some of the, you know, benefits to, even if you come up with a goal that you're not sure if you're going to reach, or you're not sure if you know that's entirely possible, having the direction to go in, you know, allows you to move forward and continue the process. And, you know, making goals and plans to achieve those goals, you know, such that they are achievable, I think is also part of that process as well. And so, you know, this I would say, you know, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's, you know, some of the fun of the work is, you know, envisioning the ideal world that we may be working towards or hoping to be working towards, and being able to have some of those conversations that say, yeah, like, you know, what would it really look like for, you know, our ideal of, say we want to engage the athletics department. What would it look like if they were engaged in the way that we want them to be? or if they were continuing to do the work on their own without us even having to be there in a way that we would endorse, lift up, support, all those good things. And, who else has done this before? How can we get there?
When we were working with resilience, one of the things we had them do, you've got this team, it's like, just in terms of creating a sense of purpose and identity, it's like, well, what would be a mission statement that this team could use and present, not only, understand in terms of how it connects all of them, but present to the world as well, or at least their community too. So in terms of what Jeremy is talking about, I think that's really significant and useful, just in terms of how do we, think of ourselves, how do we know where we're going and what we're doing. So.
And, I would just point to, with some of the ways that it shows up in the JWI case study, I think that mirrors some of the ways that we can see this showing up for some of you all who are directly plugged into the OVW campus grant. Having the structure of a grant that says you're going to plan and collect data and assess the needs first, and then you'll implement, and then you'll work on sustainability, allows you to have a structure to do these to incorporate these different steps into the work already. And even without grant funding directly, I think these steps, kind of like that structure, offers a place to turn to for, where are we in our plan? How does the plan maybe need to change, or how do we need to revisit it? And I think that we see that, in the JWI case study with their, ability to create a strategic plan earlier on in the process of the grant work.
Well, and in a lot of ways, their work changed dramatically. I mean, this is not exactly what they had to create. When you submit a grant, that you're creating a plan for what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and who you're going to do it with. And so obviously they had done that, and they, changed. I mean, they had some sense that it would change, but it changed significantly based on the assessment work that they had done, and they realized that the baseline program that they had going into the grant wasn't going to be as useful as I thought it would be, that they really needed to kind of start more from the ground zero. And, I think that becomes clear just in terms of, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but just how much they had to adapt everything and create everything in relation to the particular culture that they were trying to reach and get buy-in from. So, I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty phenomenal that they could get an Orthodox Jewish community to buy into healthy masculinity. It's a huge success story as far as I think Men Can Stop Rape is concerned. So, why don't we change how step 3 is relevant for you? But can any of you on here, can you let us know whether you have experience creating a strategic plan or a logic model? We're just curious about who has that experience. So, not everybody does, which is understandable. More in theory than practice. We'll give everybody a little more time, because I do want to see whether people have experience doing either one or both. Or we created the first logic model we created actually was for our Men of Strength Club, and it was a while ago because we got a technical assistance grant from the CDC to do some things like that. actually not really. Definitely need more knowledge and about the process. So just curious. It's not a, usually somebody will have some experience. Jessica has some experience with developing a strategic plan. Also created one as an organization, yes, focusing on individual programs, great. So I think one of the, again, I mentioned earlier how people who are communities in West Virginia, campuses in West Virginia, might serve as a resource. If you don't have experience for creating a strategic plan or a logic model, certainly we can send you some links if it's something you are interested in doing at some point. Nikki, they've done some TA, but there's been a lack of completion with logic models and plans. If it's unfamiliar, we've done it organizationally. I think we've done it. Created one for the OVW grant. You have to do it for that. So there might be some places to go. Strategic Solutions came in last year to assist. Most ICC members have their workbook as a resource. So there's a workbook that could be a potential resource if you decide it's something you want to do. Within the campus work, the campus program, they have to create a strategic plan that addresses a lot of different issues, fits in a lot of different issues, prevention, conduct, law enforcement. I can't remember them all, but engaging men is one of them that they have to integrate into the strategic plan. So it's as director of strategic planning or strategy and planning, whatever my title is. I'm a fan of that, even if it's just planning. And when we did our Healthy Masculinity Action Process, which I talked about yesterday, I laid out a whole plan for the 2 years about how we would do it. And we stuck to that in many ways, but it had to be adjusted in various ways along the way. So as Jeremy was suggesting, it should always be viewed and treated as a living document. It's not something that's written in stone. It's just a blueprint to start out with, and you may have to make adjustments as you go along. And if you find strategic plan a little daunting, the whole idea of goals and objectives and action steps, if you find that daunting, then just go to the planning level, and don't feel like you have to do the goals and objectives. But something that says this is the shape of what we're trying to do, I think is really useful, and certainly proved to be the case for JWI.
And I want to add too, Pat. I'm mindful of our time. We're on step 3, and we got some ways to go. But like Pat had said, we won't be asking all these questions for every step. But I just want to offer too, for those of you who do have some experience developing a strategic plan, especially if you've had to for OVW work, I'd be curious to know what resources you turn to support your own capacity to invest in your strategy and your planning. And are those kinds of resources things that your colleagues on this webinar can access? How can you all as a group, really function as the coalition that you all are?
And we know Strategic Solutions is one of those resources. So undoubtedly, there are others.
So let's move forward.
So we're going to whip through the rest of it.
Yep. So step 4, the team and partners develop culturally informed, positive, engaging boys and men programming that is varied and based on the role of healthy masculinity in the prevention of gender-based violence. And so, Pat had just mentioned engaging men as part of the, campus grant work. under OVW. And, engaging men is interesting because it has this, way of being sort of like a cultural competency, and it's sort of, a facet of, well, if we're going to, from the public health approach, if we're going to engage, our community, then we need to be targeted in the populations of the community that we're trying to engage. And so back to our exercises yesterday with the real man and the strongest man, talking about, the messages that boys and men receive as boys and men that socialize who they are in dominant and counter-story ways. The expertise that you all brought to those exercises really informs, I think, what part of what we mean here with developing culturally informed, programming that is informed by the culture of the communities that you serve. And back to the, positivity that we want to have incorporated in there, and back to the ways that healthy masculinity can be central to that. These are components that we encourage as being part of this step, as being central to this step. Pat, were you going to?
Nope.
Oh.
Keep moving.
So some questions, to consider for this step, does programming that might culturally resonate in my community already exist? Is there programming that can be adapted? Will we have to create our own? Or can we, borrow and learn from our neighbors? Before implementation, who can provide feedback on whether the programming is culturally relevant for males and men in the community? And I would just add, back to the Doane University example that I had shared and the story from that campus. They piloted the campus athletics project with their football team and then branched out to the rest of the athletics department. But they also wanted to reach their fraternity population. And so they took all the components from that athletics project and they sort of distilled it down into some of the bare bones and offered an opportunity for fraternity members to be invited to lunch and participate in 1 hour or half an hour kind of versions of the different activities. And those fraternity members offered their feedback, how they experienced it, what they may have been looking for or expecting differently than what was presented, or things that they liked and they'd like to see more of. And that was a 10-week process that the campus then used to create a program for fraternities to do their own program, to have 10-minute exercises that they do led by fraternity leaders in the Interfraternity Council. And the benefit of them participating in this whole long process and spending a whole semester to do it allows for the office that's responsible for it and the fraternity council to say, our members helped create this. This is born of our community to some degree, and gives them a sense of ownership to it. And so I would just offer that as an example, for where these questions are guiding and going as well. And so as we move along, please do jump in with your questions as you have them. I'm going to move on to next piece. Pat, do you want to take step 4 in the JWI case study?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will speak to that. I mean, one of the interesting things, for instance, in terms of developing the programming, was that they had gone into it thinking that social media would play a role in that, and then they got in the community and the rabbi said, no, that will not work at all. So, again, in terms of adjustments, that's just one example. But if you look at the impact case study, you'll see that they talked about a half-day training and programming they created for that. And you'll see that they used let's see, I'm trying to find the place. Where was it? Oh, yes, it's actually on the last page, where they turned to the Torah text. So they were using religious language, and they used mensch, which means good person, but they played a role. They accented the men, and they stressed four principles that were from the Holy Scripture: communication without anger, resolving conflict, empathy, and being part of a team. So those were all drawn from really the Torah and their religious texts that were important to them. And the rabbis played a role in helping kind of determine that was something that would resonate within the community. So their programming was really built around all of that.
Okay. I'm going to move up to step 5.
I'm gonna zip through step 5. So this is really all about training educators, inviting non-traditional community members to participate in programming and events. Certainly that was the case with JWI. Just in terms of the rabbis were doing some of the trainings, and not only the ones who were the social workers, but rabbis who were not the two social workers as well. So really those influencers within the community kind of came to play central roles and gave really permission to everybody else to participate in the project because they were the ones that everybody listened to. So it was crucial that they give that legitimacy to the project. And the JWI participated in the training in a number of ways. I'm just going to cover the JWI part now. We did actually one staff from JWI and then a rabbi attended the Healthy Masculinity Training Institute, which I talked about earlier. I did a training for them on creating public awareness, public education campaigns. They attended any number of trainings that we did as part of institutes that were part of the grant program that we were technical assistance providers for. So there were a number of ways in which they got both technical assistance from us. We reviewed both their strategic plan. We reviewed all the programming materials they created before they used them, all those sorts of things. So they had a lot of our input in the creation, and they got a lot of training in terms of figuring out how to do it all. And it helped, I think, significantly. So if you want to move on, Jeremy. So some of the questions to ask. What are the cultural values of the audience being trained, and do they play a key role in engaging boys and men training? I would suggest that's certainly the case in JWI instance. I think it's always the case. Is the training interactive, even if it's a short training? I feel like in terms of adult learning theory and applying it, recognizing that people are bringing attitudes, insights, knowledge to the trainings, to the sessions, to the workshops, creating space for those to be shared so that you can engage with them as the facilitator in training, not only you, but also the other participants as well, that what you're doing is going to be more successful also if you do that as well. So I'll keep moving on. And I already talked about how it shows up in JWI, so we want to move on to 6.
So yeah, step 6, the community implements the programming and begins to develop a sustainability plan for comprehensively mobilizing boys and men. And I'm really thinking that, with this step, how in particular, campuses that I've worked with, are juggling, wanting to expand the reach of the community. Once they got a program in place and they're starting to do it, how do we get more men involved? And that's being juggled with how do we deepen the work that we are already doing with this group of boys and men, or with the community in particular. How do we juggle the two of those for continuing on the work and sustaining it? And, this also comes back to forming the team and paying attention to the capacity that subcommittee or coordinated community response team has to continue doing the work, because we all know that, with the turnover that any organization or campus institution has to deal with, there's, it benefits the infrastructure to have a place where some of the work can land and lie, even if it has to be like a baton passed between hands. And let's see, some of our questions. Oh. So where do the boys and men in the community go, and what do they do? How can you best reach them in where they are? And how can you sustain engaging boys and men programming so that boys and men are exposed to it multiple times? The multiple times piece, Pat, what you were saying just before reminds me of touches, with trainings, right? You can go to specific trainings that are anywhere from an hour to 3 days long, like what we do at Men Can Stop Rape, and yet we believe this work is for a lifetime. So, what are some ways that we can incorporate more regularly into the community's experiences? The dosage, the multiple doses of getting to interact with these conversations, the people who are leading them, and the social norm change that we're working towards. And I would just point to, Pat, sustainability is interesting, right? Because there's, like relationship building, there's so many aspects where it can exist and show up in the work. And one of the places that I'm drawn to in the JWI case study is, again, back to the approach that Deborah Rosenblum was talking about in wanting to approach the community as, we're not going to tell you what you're doing wrong or what's wrong, or even really start or lead with the problem, but we're going to come in and say, how can we help? And that shift in approach is an investment in the sustainability, just as much as all the relationship building components and training components are for implementing the program. So too is that initial approach. We see the benefits on the back end, the long-term investment of how do we continue this on with the positivity that we've already brought.
In terms of media and where they are, as we suggested, social media wasn't it, but they actually have a number of different sports programs, and so they include some of that imagery around that. A public education campaign, the rabbis spoke, which they do regularly, and so they spoke on some of these issues. And so again, it was like, where do they already go? How can we get them there? So let's go on to 7. And this next step, we really, we really don't see this so much in the impact case study. The team and community invest in sustainability by developing a method to provide ongoing engaging men and boys and men training to community allies. The impact case study covers the course of really 3 years, but beyond those 3 years, it doesn't go beyond that. And it's really at the end of those 3 years, I think that they've just implemented this programming in a successful kind of way. And so the question is, where do they go from that point? And I do know that the public education campaign and the trainings, workshops, speaking engagements, all opened the door for them. They felt like, but not only them, but also for their domestic violence organization that was a partner, and that actually was closely connected to the community. And so I know that they've been able to sustain more engagement, and that JWIs. I know that they've been able to sustain engagement beyond those 3 years, but I can't go into the detail about how they have. But at that point, it's really a time for kind of renewal and looking at, okay, what do we do, and where do we go from here? So you're kind of, not at stage 1 exactly, because you built this, but you're at that stage where you're kind of figuring out, okay, how do we, what kind of plan do we need now to continue to make sure that this moves forward? So you want to move on to the questions?
Oops, sorry.
Oh.
Right. So, okay.
So basically, it's, so that's why I say, look back to steps 3 through 5 when I say, okay, we're at this place now, that where these same questions apply in terms of us kind of rethinking where we are now and planning again and figuring out how do we sustain this. So, and you want to go on to step 8?
Yeah. And so I'm mindful that we're at 2:32. I'm just going to ask for 3 more minutes, folks, to wrap up this point and answer some questions. So team members for Step 8, team members and key allies assess / evaluate the effectiveness of the Engaging Men, Boys and Men programming, improve it, and continue implementing it. And, back to our environmental change model that Pat mentioned earlier, revise and evaluate, repeat and sustain are some real central components for continuing the cycle and allowing it to refresh into some degree. And, we know that there are a lot of important things that we've learned from all the researchers and all the community people who have already put their heads together and really built the wheel of how do we collect data in an ongoing way that informs how we can improve this work going forward and allow it to be nimble and adaptable to the different populations, specific populations that you're looking to serve, or to be, sustainable across, the different staff members and program people who are delivering it, as well as the different, time periods that particular community is in. I mean, it's one of the things that we acknowledge, and our executive director, Neil Irvin, talks about, is that every single day on a college campus, the community is different. Every single day, you're getting closer to the end of the semester, and the environment and the social norms changing. And I would just say, from my experience, I remember college being a very accelerated environment where things are happening quickly, and you're moving right through it. And so how do we make some, certain kinds of insertions into that unfolding process of implementing the program and relationship building and investing in the sustainability? How can we learn from those experiences to better inform ways of doing it in the future? I don't know if those are the questions that we were going to ask. Right. So, what does your team have the capacity to do in terms of assessment and evaluations? Focus groups, like we talked about with the public education campaigns, listening sessions, surveys like the one that we're going to give you at the end of this webinar, and evaluations, key informant interviews. These sorts of things are examples of some different ways to learn from the community and assess the program. But can you use, those results to secure more funding and to sustain the work in that way? How can you use the data that you've already got, that you're already collecting, and looking to do so in the future to continue the work onwards? And so Pat had mentioned. Go ahead, Pat.
Well, I was just going to say it's 2:35. So we're happy to, if there are any questions, we're happy to stay around, or if there are any thoughts. But it's up to you, really. So.
And thank you, Sarah, for.
Thank everybody today for participating. Thank you, Jeremy and Pat, again, for sharing your knowledge with us and your time. Really great information for us to take back, as individuals, or to our organizations, or on our campuses, even for bigger groups to really think about, so like the Intercollegiate Council here, and really think about what our next steps can be. So thank you guys so much. I did put up the link to the survey, and just a reminder that Part 3, Where Do You Stand? Healthy Masculinity and Men Taking Action is tomorrow. And it will really build on the launch of Men Can Stop Rape's Where Do You Stand campaign, which is a really effective bystander intervention campaign. So we hope that folks will join us tomorrow for that.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Again, it was a pleasure to spend these 2 sessions with you. We hope we'll see some of you tomorrow at that session, and, well, not see you because we're not really seeing anybody, but hopefully you'll be
They can see us.
Participants. Yes. Yeah, so thanks, everybody.
You all take care, and please do fill out the evaluation if you can. It would really help us out for future work, and we'd love to know what you all think.
And it won't take long, we promise.
No, it's brief. All right. Oh, I should put up our email addresses. Oops.
Oh, yeah. I need to do that. Let's stay on for a little bit.
There we go.
I think we're
Oh, that's good. Okay. So, thank you, Sarah. So, what we can do is I'm gonna pause my screen share. I've got a separate link for today. I was hoping that it would not say they couldn't take it for those who already did fill out the evaluation. But no worries. We've got an updated link. Just give me 1 second here. Thank you for letting me know, Sarah, and thank you for pulling up the link and sharing it with everybody. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, if you just give me that link, I can send it out to folks.
Wonderful.